As someone who has traversed the experience of conversion from vaguely undefined agnosticism to eventually Catholicism, I can verify that people love a good conversion story. Whenever I'm introduced to someone or invited to speak somewhere or be interviewed by someone, that's almost always the thing that they want to hear about. Which is probably why conversion stories away from Christianity, or what is commonly called deconstruction, can be so aggravating and abrasive to people of faith. But as someone who does this kind of work, what you might call an evangelist or an apologist, I've tried to listen to those kinds of stories intently, not to mention the times I've spent one-on-one with people I know going through that experience. And what I found especially interesting about people who specifically use the phrase, "I deconstructed," is that they're not describing themselves as someone whose interest in their religious practice just faded away, or they simply became spiritually lethargic and turned around one day and realized they couldn't claim to be a Christian anymore. Instead, when I listen to those stories or I spend time with people going through that experience one-on-one, they almost always claim that this was a rational process of inquiry. They're saying that they encountered some argument or evidence that called into question the plausibility of the doctrines of their Christianity or some other faith tradition. And the more they explored, the more that house of cards became vulnerable to the weight of all the alternative arguments. And you don't have to look far to hear these kinds of testimonies. They're all over the place on YouTube and elsewhere. But it usually follows a pattern something like this. I encountered an argument against theism or against Christianity that I couldn't answer. And the more I looked into it, the more I was convinced by it. And unanimously, they always appeal to reason as their motivation. If you ask them why they lost their faith, the reply is always in the form of an argument against Christianity. They always frame themselves as like tireless seekers of truth who couldn't in good conscience remain Christian in the face of what appears to be overwhelming evidence to the contrary. And I don't want to say that nobody legitimately has a crisis of faith brought on by some intellectual struggle. I've known some people who have gone down this path and their explanations were robust and worth considering, but a lot, perhaps even most of what I've seen and heard in these testimonies is a massive inconsistency. Because there are a lot of things we do in this life, things of consequence even, that we couldn't defend rationally, and yet we just carry on doing them. Like, there are extremely compelling and persuasive philosophical arguments against the political party you support. Arguments I'm willing to bet most people could not defend themselves against. But those same people will still go on supporting those parties and their policies. There are compelling and popular arguments out there these days against the idea of getting married. You'll hear people decry how risky it is to get married to someone during a swell of intoxicating hormones and infatuation spurred on by young age and inexperience, even though there's a high percentage of failure, even though the consequences of failure can be psychologically and economically catastrophic. And yet you could present these arguments to a young couple who may have no answer to any of the points you make, and would any of us be surprised if they still proceeded with their wedding? I can think of philosophers like Bertrand Russell, who argues against marriage itself as an institution in his book Marriage and Morals. And I bet you could pose those kinds of arguments to happily married couples who would be helpless to reply with arguments of their own, but wouldn't for a second be persuaded to end their marriage as a result, because they're happy. There are arguments for like veganism and vegetarianism from philosophers like Peter Singer that I expect most people would be unable to answer again. And yet, in spite of the apparent indefensibility of their habit of eating meat, they will just carry on doing so. What about something like your job? What if like a highly analytic person examined your personality, your history, and your career path and convincingly argued that it was not the right career for you? Maybe some people would respond to that by making a change, but I bet most people would ignore the arguments and just go back to their job the very next day. Or we could talk about the morality of self-sacrifice in the service of others. There's actually no rational basis for that moral doctrine. There's no logical reason why a person should make sacrifices for someone else with no reciprocal benefit, and yet almost everyone will give at least lip service to this belief. In reality, religious revelation, and most especially the teachings and enduring influence of Jesus Christ, are the reason why we hold fast to this belief. But if you put that under serious philosophical scrutiny, like someone like Friedrich Nietzsche did, you find virtually no rational foundation for this behavior or belief other than appeals to God. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that arguments against marriage or eating meat and staying in your career are unanswerable. I'm just saying that most people are not equipped to answer the likes of a Bertrand Russell or a Peter Singer on these kinds of questions, and will nonetheless carry on living the lives that committed to a pattern that stands in contrast to arguments that they themselves can't answer. So what is my point in all of this? My point is that very little of what we do is based on an unassailable commitment to the dictates of reason. And in fact, I think that's actually a problem. I think most of our lives should be governed by reason, but the reality is most of us do not submit to the high seat of reason, even when arguments that we can't answer are offered to us. Which is why when people who have abandoned the practice of their religion give arguments as their sole motivation for this change of direction in their lives, I can't help but think like there's some dishonesty at play here. Because again, if someone offered them the same arguments for why eating meat was wrong, or why monogamy is unnatural, or a whole range of other moral considerations that they couldn't answer themselves, I bet it would have little standing or influence in their lifestyle choices. So why is there this double standard with God and religion? Again, remember, if you say, I couldn't answer this argument for atheism, or I couldn't answer this argument against the Trinity or the resurrection of Jesus, fine. But you can't also answer arguments against all kinds of things you're currently doing and you aren't paying any attention to. Just this one that gives you a reason to abandon the practice of your religion. What I find particularly interesting is when I've had conversations with people in this position and I ask them if they've gone out looking for refutations to their dilemmas, and they always claim that they couldn't find any satisfying answers out there. But here's the problem with that. We all have a limitation on what degree of complexity of argument we can negotiate. Let me say it a different way. There are arguments out there for and against our religious beliefs that are more sophisticated than our ability to understand. For example, if someone said to me, I encountered this particular argument against the existence of God, and now I can no longer believe in him. What if I said to that person, okay, well, what about something like Kurt Gödel's ontological argument? Have you explored that? Did you not find that convincing? I think they'd have two options in the face of something like that. They could say, yeah, I wasn't convinced by it. Or they could say, actually, I didn't understand it. In the former scenario, they'd be making a claim that arguably the greatest logician of the 20th century, who was convinced by the logic of this argument, an argument which, when formalized for computational verification, was found to be perfectly logically sound, but that you've somehow managed to detect its flaws. You who don't even know how to submit your taxes at the end of the year without making mistakes. And I guarantee you're going to get somebody in the comments on this video who goes, actually, Gödel's ontological argument relies on axioms that are unproven, because they read that in a Wikipedia article somewhere. Any honest, normal person encountering that argument has to admit they've met the limits of their own logical processing capabilities. And this is true of any subject. There are people who are specialized and smarter than you who are arguing for and against something you are convinced by. It isn't the case that there are no answers for your logical complaints. It's that you and I aren't capable of understanding all of the answers that are out there. So in that scenario, for the people who claim to have deconstructed, is it true that they've managed to find the exact optimized reply to their arguments, the one that sits right at the summit of their threshold of their own rational ability, and found that those arguments did not satisfy the challenges that they've set against their religion? Because if I had to put money down on it, I'd bet that the answer to that question is almost unanimously no. And even if they could honestly say yes, for the sake of their own integrity and internal consistency, if reason really does rule their lives, then I expect they'll be scrutinizing all of their lifestyle choices with the same level of rational skepticism. Or maybe that's just not how people live, which is why I find these rational accounts of religious deconstruction to be extremely suspicious whenever I hear them. In reality, we base our behaviors and our decisions on a whole range of motives that include our passions, our commitments, our loyalties, our compulsions, and as often as not, just what we want to do. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that we should ignore logical difficulties or apparent rational inconsistencies in our beliefs. We absolutely should scrutinize those and try to make sense of them. But when people say, I heard this argument and nobody out there had an answer for it. That just reeks of dishonesty to me. I guarantee there's an answer out there that is offered by someone a lot smarter than the person making that claim. And the fact they haven't done the homework necessary to find it suggests to me that has as much to do with something like, I don't know, laziness or emotional desire than it does with reason. Because at the end of the day, the Christian religion is not easy to practice. It makes demands on every aspect of our lives. It requires us to be constantly moving forward in faith and the willingness to examine our lives and repent of our failures every day. And some people just don't have the stamina to do that. Some people aren't willing to continually confront the skeletons in their closets and the dark recesses of their personality. Some people don't like being ultimately accountable to God as their judge and would rather pretend like he doesn't exist. So when an apparent lifeline in the form of a seemingly reasonable argument appears, they latch onto it. So if that's wrong, and I'd argue it is, what should we do when we encounter difficult arguments against our beliefs? Well, I'd say we need to exercise humility by admitting that our reason isn't always up to the task of solving the most difficult questions of the nature of something like ultimate reality, which is what we mean by God. And though there are compelling arguments against your beliefs, there are also compelling arguments for it. So if you're going to live your life motivated by your reason, you're going to need to do your homework. But you also need to follow your moral intuitions and your conscience. Again, in all other areas of life, there might be moral arguments that you can't answer that claim that something like marriage and monogamy are incompatible with human flourishing. But unless you're looking for an excuse to do so, nobody's going to go out and divorce their spouse over that. Why? Because they know that's wrong. They don't have to solve the intellectual riddle. Their conscience is screaming the answer at them. We should have a similar resolve when it comes to our faith and our religion. And if we're willing to admit logical arguments, we have to be ready to admit all the evidence of that court of judgment. And that can be something like a lifetime inquiry, which is how I would characterize my own relationship between faith and reason. I'm constantly studying, constantly learning, constantly evaluating. When I feel like my understanding is failing or under strain, I give it some time and do some more study. And in my experience, I've always found satisfying answers because I'm looking for them. I also have, on top of that, a huge inventory of evidence from my own experience confirming that God is real. God answers my prayers. God has performed miracles in my life and in those that I love. And God has given me graces that have healed serious defects in my own personality that I know I can't take credit for. All of those kinds of considerations need to be weighed in the balance. So if you find yourself on the path of deconstruction, first ask yourself if you're being consistent. Just like you wouldn't suddenly stop eating meat or honoring your marriage, a mere argument against your religion shouldn't be enough to derail your position within the church, at least not without some serious effort on your part to rescue it. Okay, thanks for watching. These videos and this channel are only possible because of viewer support, so if you can spare some help, please consider making a contribution through my website at brianholdsworth.ca or join my locals community at brianholdsworth.locals.com, where you can interact with myself and other like-minded individuals. We actually just started a monthly Zoom meetup where we're studying some articles of St. Thomas Aquinas in his Summa. So if that's interesting to you, then come join us there. And of course, don't forget to like and subscribe.